Württemberg, Germany, 1827. Deep within the vaulted archives of Stuttgart's Municipal Records Office, a restoration clerk made a discovery that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. Between the crumbling pages of a judicial ledger, he found a folded parchment sealed with black wax, a death pact signed in blood by two lovers, accompanied by a confession so disturbing that local magistrates had ordered it buried, never to be spoken of again. The document detailed not a suicide agreement, but something far more sinister. A covenant between two young lovers who pledged to commit murder together, believing that shared bloodshed would bind their souls for eternity. The parchment bore two names: Friedrich Handel, a theology student, and Margarethe Schiller, a merchant's daughter. Both had vanished from historical record after the spring of 1827. No graves, no trial transcripts, no obituaries. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole, and with them, the memory of what they had done. This is the story of a love so obsessive, so twisted in its devotion, that it transformed two ordinary people into instruments of calculated death. It is a story that challenges everything we think we know about passion, madness, and the darkness that lives in the human heart when reason abandons it. What drives two lovers to believe that murder, not marriage, not family, not faith, is the ultimate expression of their bond? And why did an entire community conspire to erase their existence from history? Before we descend into this forgotten nightmare, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Because what you're about to hear isn't just a tale of distant horror. It's a reminder that the most terrifying acts in history are often those we've deliberately chosen to forget. The Kingdom of Württemberg in the 1822 was a place caught between worlds. The Napoleonic Wars had ended barely a decade earlier, leaving Europe scarred and uncertain. Traditional religious authorities still governed daily life. Yet romantic philosophy was seeping into the minds of the young ideas about transcendent love, the supremacy of emotion over reason, the glorification of death as a gateway to eternal unity. In the cobblestone streets of Stuttgart, the old and new collided with increasing violence. It was in this volatile atmosphere that Friedrich Handel and Margarethe Schiller first met. Friedrich was 23 years old, the youngest son of a Lutheran minister who had sent him to study theology at the Tübingen Seminary. By all accounts, he was brilliant, but troubled, prone to long silences, obsessive readings of mystical texts, and a fascination with martyrdom that disturbed even his professors. His journals, recovered decades later, reveal a mind consumed by the idea of proving love's immortality through sacrifice. He wrote repeatedly of his disgust with ordinary life, with its commerce and compromises, its shallow affections and convenient faiths. He wanted something absolute, something that could not be diluted or denied. Margarethe was 19, the eldest daughter of a prosperous textile merchant. She had been educated beyond what was typical for women of her class. Her father, influenced by Enlightenment ideals, had hired tutors to teach her literature, philosophy, and even Latin. But this education had isolated her. She found herself unable to relate to other young women her age, contemptuous of their concerns with dowries and domestic arrangements. In her private correspondence with a cousin in Bavaria, she confessed feeling like a ghost walking among the living, unable to touch or be touched by the trivialities that animate them. She craved intensity. She craved meaning. She craved someone who could see the world as she did, as a place too small and suffocating for the magnitude of what she felt inside. They met in the autumn of 1826 at a literary salon hosted by a local bookseller. The gathering was one of those semi-clandestine affairs where young intellectuals discussed forbidden authors Byron, Shelley, the German Romantics, who preached that conventional morality was a prison for superior souls. Friedrich had been invited by a fellow seminarian. Margarethe attended with her younger brother, who frequented such circles despite their father's disapproval. Witnesses later reported that the two barely spoke that first evening, but they watched each other with an intensity that made others uncomfortable. One attendee described it as two people recognizing something in each other that the rest of us could not see and perhaps should not have wanted to. Their courtship, if it can be called that, unfolded in secret over the following months. They met in the gardens behind the Stiftskirche after evening prayers. They exchanged letters written in code, using classical references and philosophical fragments to disguise the growing extremity of their attachment. In one letter, Friedrich wrote, "To love as others love is to accept the slow death of the soul. We must love differently. We must love in a way that leaves marks upon eternity itself. Margarethe responded, I would rather die with you in one moment of absolute truth than live 100 years in the lie of ordinary happiness. What began as passionate idealism gradually twisted into something darker. Friedrich became convinced that their love could only be proven genuine if it involved a shared transgression so profound that it would forever separate them from the rest of humanity. He began to speak of blood covenants, of ancient rituals that bound souls beyond death. He referenced obscure theological texts about martyrs who had sealed their faith through violence. Margarethe, rather than recoiling, found herself drawn deeper into his vision. In her diary discovered hidden behind a loose brick in her family's former home in 1889, she wrote, He speaks of things that terrify me, yet I cannot turn away. It is as if he has found the words for feelings I have always carried but never dared to name. If love is truly eternal, must it not be tested by something greater than mere devotion? Must it not be proven through an act that ordinary souls would never dare? By early 1827, their letters began to reference the pact with increasing frequency. They spoke in abstractions at first about needing to prove their bond beyond all doubt, to enact their philosophy rather than merely discuss it. But gradually, horrifyingly, the abstractions became concrete. They began to discuss specific acts, specific people. Friedrich argued that to kill together would be the ultimate expression of shared will, the ultimate proof that they existed beyond conventional morality. Margarethe agreed, adding her own twisted logic, that their victim should be someone who embodied everything they despised about ordinary life, someone comfortable, complacent, satisfied with the shallow pleasures of existence. They chose their victim with chilling deliberation. Her name was Anna Kopf, a 38-year-old widow who ran a boarding house near the city's eastern gate. She was known for her kindness, her practical wisdom, her contentment with a simple life. She took in boarders, cared for her elderly mother, attended church faithfully, and asked for nothing more than what she had. To Friedrich and Margarethe, she represented everything they had come to loathe: the acceptance of ordinary existence, the willingness to live without grand passion or transcendent meaning. In their correspondence, they referred to her as the symbol, claiming that her death would be not murder but a philosophical statement, a rejection of the mediocrity that suffocated superior souls like themselves. On the night of April 14th, 1827, they met by candlelight in the ruins of an abandoned chapel outside the city walls. Friedrich had brought a knife and a document he had prepared: the pact. Written in elaborate Gothic script, it declared their eternal bond and their willingness to prove it through shared bloodshed. They both signed it. Then, according to the confession later discovered, they each cut their palms and pressed their bleeding hands together, mingling their blood as a seal. Margarethe wrote in her diary that night, "We are no longer separate beings. We are one will, one purpose, one soul. Tomorrow, we become eternal." The following evening, they arrived at Anna Kopf's boarding house separately, careful not to arouse suspicion. Friedrich posed as a potential boarder, inquiring about rooms. Margarethe arrived shortly after, claiming to be his sister, helping him evaluate the accommodations. Anna welcomed them warmly, showing them the available rooms, offering them tea. She spoke of her late husband, her hopes for the boarding house, her gratitude for the life she had built. As she spoke, Friedrich and Margarethe exchanged glances. They had agreed on a signal. When Margarethe touched her throat, it would begin. Anna Kopf led them up the narrow wooden staircase to the second floor, describing the view from the window, the quiet neighborhood, the reasonable weekly rate. The evening light filtered through lace curtains, casting soft shadows across the modest room. She was in the middle of explaining the house rules when Margarethe's hand rose slowly to her throat. The signal! Friedrich moved first. He stepped behind Anna with practiced swiftness, wrapping one arm around her chest while the other brought the knife to her throat. But Anna was stronger than they had anticipated. She struggled violently, knocking over a wash basin. Her screams, muffled by Friedrich's hand, clamped over her mouth. Margarethe, frozen for only a heartbeat, rushed forward and grabbed Anna's arms, pinning them as the older woman thrashed desperately. What followed was not the clean, philosophical act they had imagined. It was brutal, chaotic, and agonizingly slow. The knife struck multiple times, shoulders, neck, chest, as all three bodies crashed against the furniture. Blood sprayed across the whitewashed walls. Anna's elderly mother, hard of hearing and confined to the ground floor, heard nothing over her evening prayers. When Anna finally stopped moving, Friedrich and Margarethe stood panting in the darkening room, covered in blood that was not their own. The reality of what they had done settled over them like ice water. This was not transcendence. This was not philosophical purity. This was murder, raw and irreversible. According to the confession, they remained in that room for nearly an hour, unable to speak, unable to move, staring at Anna's body, sprawled across the floor in a spreading pool of crimson. Margarethe later wrote, "In that moment, I understood that we had not transcended humanity, we had descended below it. We had become something worse than animals, because animals kill from necessity. We killed from pride. But they had sworn a pact, and the pact demanded they see it through to the end. They cleaned themselves as best they could using water from the remaining wash basin, wrapped Anna's body in bedsheets, and waited for full darkness. Around midnight, they carried her body down the back stairs and into the small garden behind the boarding house. They had brought a shovel hidden earlier in the hedgerow. They dug in silence, taking turns, their hands blistering, their backs screaming with pain. They buried Anna Kopf in her own garden, beneath the rose bushes she had tended for years. Then they replaced the soil, scattered leaves and debris to hide the disturbed earth, and slipped away into the night separately as they had arrived. The next morning, Anna's mother woke to find her daughter gone. The breakfast table remained unset. The hearth was cold. At first, the old woman assumed Anna had gone to market early, but as hours passed and neighbors came calling, concern grew into alarm. By afternoon, the municipal police had been notified. Constable Hans Weber, a 30-year veteran who had spent most of his career dealing with petty theft and public drunkenness, found himself investigating a disappearance that made no sense. Anna's belongings were untouched. Her coat and shoes remained by the door. No one had seen her leave. Several neighbors reported that two young people, a man and a woman, had visited the previous evening, but their descriptions were vague, contradictory. One said the young woman wore blue. Another insisted it was gray. The young man was tall, or perhaps average height, clean-shaven or possibly bearded. Memory, Weber had learned long ago, was an unreliable witness. For 3 days, the investigation circled without direction. Weber interviewed the boarders, the neighbors, the merchants. Anna regularly patronized. Everyone spoke of her kindness, her reliability, her predictable routine. She was not the type to vanish. She had no debts, no enemies, no secret troubles. The constable began to suspect foul play, but without a body, without evidence, without even a clear motive, he had nothing to pursue. The city's magistrate, overwhelmed with cases and reluctant to dedicate resources to what might simply be an unfortunate abandonment of an elderly parent, pressured Weber to close the investigation. "People leave," the magistrate said dismissively. "Widows sometimes grow tired of responsibility and start new lives elsewhere. File it as a missing person and move on." But Weber could not move on. Something about the case gnawed at him. He returned repeatedly to the boarding house, walking through the rooms, questioning Anna's mother again and again, searching for the detail that would break everything open. It was during his 4th visit, while examining the upstairs room where Anna had last been seen, that he noticed something peculiar. The floorboards near the window were stained a dark discoloration that had been partially scrubbed but not completely removed. He knelt, running his fingers across the wood. The stain was reddish-brown, concentrated in the cracks between boards. He called for the local physician, Dr. Emil Richter, who confirmed Weber's suspicion. Blood, a significant amount of it, and recently shed. The investigation transformed overnight. Weber ordered the entire house searched top to bottom. In the garden, one of his deputies noticed that the soil beneath the rose bushes appeared freshly turned, inconsistent with the rest of the garden's packed earth. They began to dig. Within an hour, they uncovered Anna Kopf's body, still wrapped in blood-stained sheets, her wounds evident even in decomposition's early stages. The discovery sent shockwaves through Stuttgart. This was not a crime of passion or desperation. The burial, the attempted concealment, the methodical nature of it all suggested premeditation. Someone had planned this. Someone had chosen Anna Kopf deliberately. But who and why? Weber began reconstructing Anna's final evening. He interviewed neighbors again, this time with greater urgency, pressing for details about the two visitors. Slowly, a clearer picture emerged. The young man had carried himself like an educated person. His speech was formal, his manner refined. The young woman had been well-dressed. Not wealthy, but certainly not poor, with an unusual intensity in her bearing that several neighbors remembered. One woman recalled seeing them leave separately, nearly 2 hours apart, which struck her as odd at the time. Another remembered the young man asking directions to the old chapel ruins outside the city walls earlier that same week. The chapel. Weber knew it. A Gothic ruin that attracted poets and artists, a place where young intellectuals sometimes gathered to discuss philosophy away from judgmental eyes. He sent deputies to watch the chapel, to ask questions at the literary salons and bookshops frequented by students and freethinkers. It was a bookseller named Heinrich Vogel who provided the breakthrough. He remembered a young couple who had attended one of his salons the previous autumn, a theology student named Friedrich and a merchant's daughter named Margarethe Schiller. They had never returned after that first meeting, but Vogel recalled their intensity, the way they seemed to communicate without words, the discomfort they caused among other guests. He provided descriptions that matched the neighbors' accounts. Weber now had names. Within days, he learned that Friedrich had abruptly left the Tübingen seminary in mid-April, citing a family emergency that no one could verify. Margarethe Schiller had told her family she was visiting a cousin in Bavaria, but the cousin had no knowledge of such plans. Both had vanished within days of Anna Kopf's murder. Weber obtained samples of their handwriting from the seminary and from Margarethe's father. He compared them to the guest book at Anna's boarding house. The signatures matched. Friedrich Handel and his sister had been the last people to see Anna Kopf alive. But where had they gone? Weber sent descriptions and warrants to neighboring territories, to border stations, to port authorities. In an era before photography, before telegraphs reached every village, fugitives could disappear into Europe's vast patchwork of kingdoms and principalities with relative ease. Weeks passed without leads. The magistrate, embarrassed by the murder occurring under his jurisdiction and frustrated by the lack of progress, began to pressure Weber to produce results or abandon the case. The constable refused. He became obsessed, spending his own money on informants, traveling to distant towns, following whispers and rumors, neglecting his other duties. His wife begged him to let it go. His colleagues thought he had lost perspective, but Weber could not accept that two young people could commit such a calculated murder and simply evade justice. The break came from an unexpected source. In early June, a parish priest in the Black Forest village of Schönberg, nearly 80 kilometers from Stuttgart, sent a letter to the Stuttgart magistrate's office. A young couple matching the description of the fugitives had appeared in his village 3 weeks earlier, claiming to be newlyweds, seeking a quiet place to start their life together. They had rented a small cottage on the village outskirts and kept largely to themselves. But the priest had noticed something troubling. They attended Mass daily, sitting in the back pew, never taking communion, whispering intensely to each other throughout the service. More disturbing, they had asked him repeatedly about the nature of mortal sin, about whether certain acts could be forgiven, about whether two souls could be damned together. The priest, educated in theology and psychology, recognized the signs of profound guilt. When he saw the wanted notice that had finally reached his remote parish, he felt compelled to write. Weber departed for Schönberg within hours of receiving the letter, accompanied by 2 deputies and a magistrate's warrant. They arrived at dawn on June 18th, surrounding the cottage before the sun had fully risen. Weber knocked on the door. For a long moment, there was no response. Then Friedrich Handel opened it, dressed in nightclothes, his face gaunt and pale. He looked at Weber with what the constable later described as relief. "You found us?" Friedrich said quietly. "I knew you would. I prayed you would." Behind him, Margarethe appeared, equally haggard, her eyes red from crying. She said nothing, but she did not resist when Weber's deputies placed her in custody. The cottage told a story of psychological disintegration. Every surface was covered with pages torn from books, frantic writings, desperate prayers. The walls bore religious symbols drawn in charcoal crosses, verses from scripture, crude renderings of angels and demons. In the bedroom, Weber found their journals, their correspondence, and most damning of all, the blood-signed pact they had made by candlelight in the chapel ruins. Friedrich and Margarethe had spent the week since the murder in a hell of their own creation, unable to flee further, unable to turn back, trapped between their philosophical convictions and the crushing weight of what they had actually done. During the journey back to Stuttgart, Friedrich confessed everything. He spoke in a monotone, as if reciting facts about someone else's life. He described their courtship, their growing obsession with transcendent love, their selection of Anna Kopf as a victim, the pact, the murder itself. He explained their reasoning with the same philosophical language they had used in their letters. But now it sounded hollow, absurd. the pretentious ravings of children, playing at profundity. Margarethe remained silent for most of the journey, but as they approached Stuttgart, she finally spoke. "We thought we were exceptional," she said to Weber. "We thought ordinary moral laws did not apply to us because we felt things more deeply than others. We were not exceptional. We were simply cruel." The trial of Friedrich Handel and Margarethe Schiller began on July 29, 1827, in the Stuttgart Criminal Court. It lasted only 4 days. In an era when trials could stretch for weeks, the brevity spoke to the overwhelming nature of the evidence. The prosecution presented the Blood Pact, the journals detailing their philosophical justifications, the coded letters planning Anna Kopf's murder, and the full confessions given by both defendants. The forensic evidence was equally damning. The bloodstains in Anna's boarding house matched the wounds on her body. The knife recovered from the cottage bore traces of blood and tissue, and Anna's elderly mother identified the voices she had heard that evening as belonging to a young man and woman, though she had been too deaf to hear the words themselves. What made the trial extraordinary, however, was not the evidence but the defendants' behavior. Friedrich and Margarethe did not deny their guilt. They did not plead insanity or diminished capacity, though their attorneys desperately tried to pursue such defenses. Instead, they attempted to explain themselves, to make the court understand the philosophy that had driven them to murder. Friedrich spoke for nearly 3 hours during his testimony, quoting romantic poets, German idealist philosophers, and obscure theological texts about martyrdom and transcendence. He argued that conventional morality was designed for ordinary people living ordinary lives, but that exceptional souls, those capable of experiencing love and beauty at heightened intensity, existed beyond such limitations. He claimed that their murder of Anna Kopf had been an attempt to prove that their love was absolute, that it existed outside the petty concerns of social order and religious doctrine. The courtroom listened in stunned silence. Some spectators wept, others shouted for immediate execution. The presiding judge, Albrecht Zimmermann, a man known for his measured temperament and legal precision, struggled visibly to maintain composure. When Friedrich finished speaking, Zimmermann asked him a single question. "Do you believe Anna Kopf was not a human being deserving of life?" Friedrich paused, and for the first time, his philosophical certainty wavered. "She was human," he admitted quietly. "But we believed our love was more important than her life. We believed that proving the exceptional nature of our bond justified the sacrifice of someone who lived an ordinary existence." The judge's response became famous in legal circles throughout the German states. "Then you did not love at all. You worshipped only yourselves, and you murdered an innocent woman on the altar of your own vanity." Margarethe's testimony was shorter, but somehow more disturbing. She spoke without emotion, describing the murder in clinical detail, how they had planned it, how they had carried it out, how they had felt afterward. But when the prosecutor asked whether she felt remorse, she hesitated. "I feel horror at what we did," she said slowly. "But I am not certain if what I feel is genuine remorse or simply fear of punishment. Friedrich taught me that we were beyond conventional guilt, and I believed him. Now I do not know what I believe. I do not know if I am capable of the kind of moral feeling that normal people possess. Perhaps we destroyed that capacity in ourselves when we signed the pact." Her words chilled even the most hardened observers. Here was a young woman, educated and articulate, who had so thoroughly corrupted her own moral sense that she could no longer distinguish between philosophical sophistication and basic human empathy. The defense attorneys tried desperately to save their clients from execution. They argued that Friedrich and Margarethe were victims of a dangerous philosophy that had infected European youth in the post-Napoleonic era, that they had been seduced by romantic literature into believing themselves exempt from ordinary moral constraints. They presented medical experts who testified that both defendants showed signs of moral insanity, a controversial diagnosis that suggested the inability to distinguish right from wrong despite intellectual understanding. They emphasized the defendants' youth, their lack of prior criminal behavior, their evident suffering in the weeks following the murder. But the prosecution demolished these arguments with brutal efficiency. These were not impulsive crimes of passion. This was premeditated murder, planned over months, executed with calculation, and concealed with deliberation. Friedrich and Margarethe had known exactly what they were doing. They had simply believed themselves above the law. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Both defendants were found guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Zimmermann sentenced them to death by beheading, the standard execution method for capital crimes in Württemberg. But in a highly unusual move, He added a judicial commentary that was entered into the permanent record. He stated that while the law demanded their execution, the case represented something more troubling than simple criminality. It revealed how philosophical ideas, when divorced from moral grounding and embraced by immature minds seeking to elevate themselves above their fellow humans, could produce monstrous acts. He warned that the Romantic movement's glorification of passion over reason, of transcendent love over mundane duty, of the exceptional individual over the common good, carried within it the seeds of profound evil. His words were published in legal journals and debated in universities throughout the German-speaking world. The public reaction to the verdict was complex and deeply divided. Conservative religious leaders proclaimed it a vindication of traditional moral order, proof that the dangerous philosophies spreading from France and Britain would lead society into chaos. Progressive intellectuals, embarrassed by how their own ideas had been twisted into justification for murder, attempted to distance themselves from Friedrich and Margarethe, arguing that true Romantic philosophy emphasized beauty and transcendence, not violence. But others, particularly among the young, found themselves uncomfortably drawn to the case. Letters flooded newspaper editors, some condemning the couple as monsters, others expressing confused sympathy for their attempt to live outside conventional boundaries, even while acknowledging the horror of their crime. The case became a cultural lightning rod, forcing German society to confront uncomfortable questions about individualism, moral relativism, and the consequences of valuing personal feeling over communal responsibility. For Anna Kopf's family, the verdict brought no peace. Her elderly mother survived only 3 months after the trial, dying alone in the boarding house that had become infamous. Neighbors reported hearing her weeping at night, crying out for her daughter, unable to comprehend why anyone would target such a kind and harmless woman. Anna's younger brother, a carpenter in a nearby town, attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row, forcing Friedrich and Margarethe to see the face of the family they had destroyed. After the verdict, he told reporters, "They keep talking about their love, their philosophy, their exceptional souls. My sister had a soul too. She loved her mother. She cared for strangers. She harmed no one. But because her life was ordinary, because she was content with simple joys, they decided she was expendable. They murdered her not despite her goodness, but because of it. They could not bear the existence of someone who found meaning without grand gestures or dark passions." The executions were scheduled for August 23, 1827, to be carried out at dawn in Stuttgart's main square. In the weeks leading up to the date, Friedrich and Margarethe were held in separate cells in the municipal prison. They were allowed no contact with each other, a decision made by the magistrate who feared they would use their final days to create some perverse martyrdom narrative. Friedrich spent his time writing letters to his family, begging forgiveness, theological treatises attempting to reconcile his actions with his faith. And finally, a long confession addressed to no one in particular, in which he acknowledged that every philosophical justification he had constructed was a lie he had told himself to feel exceptional. "I thought I was ascending to something higher," he wrote in his final journal entry. "I was only descending into the oldest sin, the belief that I mattered more than others, that my desires justified any action, that love could sanctify murder. I was not a philosopher. I was a narcissist. And narcissism, I now understand, is the opposite of love." Margarethe's final weeks followed a different trajectory. She refused visitors, including her distraught father, who came daily to plead for a final conversation. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, and according to prison guards, spent her days staring at the wall of her cell without expression. The prison chaplain reported that she seemed to have retreated entirely into herself, unreachable by either consolation or condemnation. Only once did she break her silence. On the night before her execution, she asked for paper and ink. She wrote a single letter, addressed to no one. In it, she described the moment in Anna Kopf's boarding house when the knife first struck, when Anna's eyes met hers in terror and disbelief. "I saw her humanity in that moment," Margarethe wrote. "I saw everything I pretended she did not possess: fear, confusion, the desperate desire to live. And I helped kill her anyway. Friedrich seduced me with philosophy, but I chose to be seduced. I wanted to believe I was exceptional. I wanted to transcend ordinary life. The price of that wanting was Anna's life. There is no forgiveness possible for what we did. There is only the acknowledgement that we were not tragic heroes. We were cowards who dressed up cruelty as courage." On the morning of August 23rd, a crowd of nearly 2,000 people gathered in Stuttgart's main square to witness the executions. Some came from morbid curiosity, others from a desire to see justice served. Still others from a complicated mix of sympathy and revulsion. Friedrich was brought out first, dressed in the simple white shirt traditional for condemned prisoners. He walked to the scaffold with surprising steadiness, refusing the blindfold, choosing to face his death fully. His last words, recorded by multiple witnesses, were, "Let no one call this love. Let no one romanticize what we did. We murdered an innocent woman because our pride convinced us we were above moral law. May God have mercy on Anna Kopf's soul, and may He judge us according to what we truly deserve." Margarethe followed minutes later. Unlike Friedrich, she appeared barely aware of her surroundings, her eyes distant, her movements mechanical. She said nothing at the scaffold, though witnesses reported that as the executioner positioned her, she whispered something too quiet for anyone but him to hear. The executioner later told the prison chaplain that her final words were, "I'm sorry, Anna. I'm so sorry." Both executions were carried out swiftly and professionally. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves in the prison cemetery, deliberately separated to prevent any posthumous reunification that might feed the romantic mythology their defense attorneys had tried to create. But the story did not end with their deaths. In the months and years that followed, the Stuttgart Magistrate's Office made a series of increasingly unusual decisions regarding the case records. All trial transcripts were removed from public access. The blood-signed pact, the journals, and the correspondence were sealed in the municipal archives with orders that they could not be viewed without special permission from the judiciary. Newspaper accounts of the trial were collected and stored separately, effectively removing them from circulation. Even the addresses involved in the case were obscured in official records. Anna Kopf's boarding house was listed only as a residence in the Eastern Quarter. Friedrich and Margarethe's homes were unidentified. It was as if the authorities, having executed the murderers, now wanted to execute the memory of the crime itself. Why this deliberate erasure? Documents discovered in the 1,890 seconds reveal the magistrate's reasoning. He feared that the case, with its elements of passionate love, philosophical transgression, and dramatic death, would be romanticized by the very youth culture that had produced Friedrich and Margarethe. He worried that making martyrs of them, even in condemnation, would inspire others drawn to the idea of transcendent love proven through transgression. Better, he decided, to let the story fade into obscurity, to be forgotten by all except those directly involved. His concern was not unfounded. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, several young couples in German universities formed so-called pact societies, writing manifestos about love beyond conventional morality, though none went so far as to commit actual crimes. The magistrate's suppression efforts aimed to starve these groups of their inspiration. The strategy worked, perhaps too well. Within a generation, the case of Friedrich Handel and Margarethe Schiller had vanished from public consciousness. Only a few legal scholars knew of it, and they discussed it only in academic contexts, stripped of names and identifying details. Anna Kopf's grave was eventually marked with a simple stone reading, AK 1000, 789 to 1000. 827, with no mention of how she died or why. Her boarding house passed through several owners, none of whom knew its history. The chapel where the pact was signed crumbled further into ruin and was eventually demolished to make way for a rail line in the 1,840 seconds. The cottage in Schönberg where Friedrich and Margarethe spent their final weeks of freedom was abandoned, then burned down under mysterious circumstances in 1835. Every physical trace of the story was methodically erased, and yet fragments survived. The restoration clerk who discovered the blood-signed pact in 1827 kept a private copy before the original was sealed away. That copy passed through his family and eventually made its way to a private collector in Munich, where it was photographed in 1903. Those photographs still exist in the Bavarian State Library. Margarethe's diary, hidden in her family home and discovered decades after the demolition of the building, surfaced in a Berlin antiquarian bookshop in 1912 and was purchased by a historian studying Romantic-era Germany. Friedrich's final journal entry was copied by the prison chaplain and included in an obscure theological text published in 1831 about repentance and divine justice. These scattered pieces allow us, almost 2 centuries later, to reconstruct what the authorities of 1,827 wanted forgotten forever. What makes this case so deeply disturbing is not just the murder itself, but what it reveals about the human capacity for self-deception. Friedrich and Margarethe were not monsters born into evil. They were educated, thoughtful young people who convinced themselves that their feelings were more important than another person's life. They wrapped cruelty in the language of philosophy and convinced themselves that transgression was transcendence. They believed that their willingness to commit murder together proved the depth of their love, when in fact, it proved only the depth of their narcissism. And perhaps most chilling of all, they maintained their self-image as exceptional, tragic figures, even as they stood covered in an innocent woman's blood, even as they confessed to her murder, even as they awaited execution. Only in their final hours did the philosophical armor crack, revealing the banal selfishness beneath. The case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we construct meaning in our lives. We want to believe that evil announces itself, that murderers are obviously different from the rest of us, that we would never be capable of such acts. But Friedrich and Margarethe looked like any other young lovers in 1827 Stuttgart. They read poetry. They discussed philosophy. They felt deeply. What separated them from thousands of other passionate young couples was not the intensity of their feelings, but their willingness to value those feelings above another human being's right to live. They mistook the strength of their emotions for moral justification. They confused the ability to articulate philosophical arguments with the possession of wisdom. They believed that because they could imagine themselves as exceptional, they actually were exceptional. History buried this story because it was too troubling, too complex, too resistant to simple moral categorization. It would have been easier if Friedrich and Margarethe had been obviously mad, if their crime had been impulsive rather than calculated, if they had shown no capacity for reflection or remorse. But they were sane, methodical, and articulate in explaining their reasoning. That is what made them truly dangerous, not their passion, but their ability to rationalize that passion into permission for murder. And that is what makes their story relevant today. In an age that often celebrates intensity of feeling over ethical restraint, that valorizes the transgressive over the responsible, that encourages people to live their truth without asking whether that truth harms others. Where does love end and narcissism begin? When does passion cross the line into obsession? How do we prevent the celebration of individual feeling from becoming permission to disregard others' humanity? These are the questions that Friedrich and Margarethe's crime forces us to ask. And they are questions without easy answers. What we can say with certainty is that love, genuine love, does not require proof through violence. It does not demand transcendence through transgression. It does not measure its worth by its willingness to destroy. Real love, the kind Anna Kopf showed in her daily care for her mother and her boarders, is found not in grand gestures or dark philosophies, but in the simple, ordinary choice to treat other human beings as worthy of respect, compassion, and life itself. So I ask you now, what forgotten horrors still lie buried in history's archives, deliberately erased because the truth they tell is too uncomfortable for us to face? How many stories have been suppressed not because they lack importance, but because they reveal aspects of human nature we would prefer not to acknowledge? And most troubling of all, how many people today, wrapped in their own philosophical justifications and convinced of their own exceptionality, are capable of acts they believe transcend morality but are in fact simple, inexcusable cruelty? If this story has unsettled you, if it has made you question the narratives we tell ourselves about love and passion and what makes us exceptional, then share it with others who need to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more forgotten histories that challenge what we think we know about the human heart. And leave a comment telling me what historical case, buried by time or intention, do you think deserves to be remembered? Because the stories we forget are often the ones we most need to remember. The Candlelit Pact of 1827 reminds us that darkness does not always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it arrives dressed in the language of philosophy, wrapped in declarations of love, justified by feelings so intense they seem to transcend ordinary morality. But intensity is not wisdom, passion is not permission. And the greatest tragedy of Friedrich Handel and Margarethe Schiller is not that they died for their crime, but that Anna Kopf died for their delusion.